The following accounts have been submitted by subscribers. These stories are claimed to describe true events. I ask you to listen in good faith and decide for yourself what to believe. This happened to me when I was 4 or 5 years old. The experience is still as clear to me today as it was then, and all the feelings are fresh in my memory. My parents and I were living in my nan's house at the time, with my dad's brothers and sister, 6 to be exact, so I was the only child in a house full of adults. As it was a 3-bedroomed house with a dodgy loft conversion on the 3rd floor, it was very cramped. It was decided that I was to share a double bed with my nan on the 3rd floor in the attic. Pretty soon after moving up there, things started. After about a week of sleeping there, I was woken by a feeling of fear and being watched. As I sat up, I saw 3 soldiers standing at the end of my bed. They were just standing there with rifles to their sides, dressed in big black hats, as they would when guarding Buckingham Palace. They said nothing. After this experience, they appeared again at the end of my bed. Nothing was ever said every time they appeared, but each and every time I was totally frightened. And I would shout, "Nan! Nan! Man! Man!" And she would wake up and ask, "Where?" And I would say, "There!" and point to the end of the bed. My nan would try and reassure me that no one was there and that I needed to learn to be a good boy. This went on for a couple of weeks, always happening late at night when I was in bed with my nan. I remember my nan having a conversation with my parents about this, as she became concerned at the consistency of what I was saying. I remember she even stayed awake one night, but even when the soldiers appeared, she could not see anything. After a couple of weeks it eased off, but then a new phenomenon started. One late night, I woke to find myself standing at the end of the bed, but when I looked, I realized I could still see myself still in bed next to my nan. I tried screaming and called for her, but she could not hear me. I was outside of my body. Quite quickly the fear I had eased, and I actually found the experience very exciting. I even had a funny knot feeling, a lot like butterflies, and learned to have a look around. One night, I decided to go down the winding stairs from the attic to the 1st floor, and then to the ground floor below to find my parents, but I found I could not go lower than the 1st floor. When descending from the attic, I could only go down the stairs by holding the stair rail and pulling myself along. If I tried to walk, it was like being stuck in treacle. On the 1st floor landing, I had to pull on something to move around there too. On a few of these nights, I was able to watch a couple of my uncles having a conversation on the 1st floor. The next morning, I mentioned to them that I had seen them talking. They simply replied, "No, you didn't. You were in bed and we didn't see you." When I told them in my 5-year-old way what they had been talking about, they just seemed amazed, but then told me to go away. This went on for a while, leaving my body and exploring the house at night. Strangely, whenever I returned to my bed, I could only access my body through my feet. One evening, when I was standing next to myself late at night, ready to pull myself downstairs, I suddenly heard a voice. I looked at my nan, but she was asleep. Besides, I am sure it was a male voice, but there was no one around. I remember how the voice was very stern. It addressed me by name and said, "You need to stop doing this. Stay in bed and do not go downstairs anymore." It's like the voice didn't want me to leave my body anymore, but as I was so young, I still went floating downstairs anyway. The next night I was told again, but I ignored this again. But on my return to the attic, the 3 soldiers I had not seen for a while were standing there, looking at me from the end of the bed. I was terrified, but one of the soldiers moved away from the end of the bed to let me get back into my body through my feet. However, when I went to get into my body, I could not. It was like fighting through treacle, and I was starting to panic and scream. My nan could not hear me, and I continued to struggle when, suddenly, the soldier who had moved away said to me, "If you do this again, you will have to come with me. and you will never return to your body again, and you will not see your parents again." He asked me if I understood. The other 2 soldiers just stood there, looking but saying nothing. I said I understood, to which the first soldier replied, "If you do this again, I will come back for you myself." After what seemed like an eternity, he gestured and I was able to return to my body. Then the soldiers disappeared. This was the last time I ever saw the soldiers or had the experience of floating around the house. Pretty much soon after that, my parents and I moved into our own house, but even whilst living there, I would not go to bed without a lot of toys and my 2 stereo speakers along the sides of my body to protect me from what I do not know. I felt something around me, something unseen for a long time after my experience. In fact, I continued to sleep that way until I was about 14 years old. I feared leaving my body again without having a choice and not being able to return as I was told. Now I am absolutely fine. I have no explanation as to what it all was about, but I guess that's why I'm so interested in the paranormal, to try and find some answers to what I experienced all those years ago. The story I am about to tell comes from a Muslim background, for Muslims do actually believe in dark entities and demons. If you tell my story, please do not mention my name. I live in a Muslim country in the north of Africa. I do not practice the religion's teachings, but have grown up surrounded by the culture and have memorized a few verses of the Quran. I grew up in a city, but every summer my mother, sister and I traveled to our grandmother's house in the countryside. There we gather with my uncles, aunts and cousins. The region is surrounded by lots of wheat fields, with few rare and distanced houses. About half a mile away from my grandmother's house, there was a huge abandoned barn that used to belong to my great-grandfather. He was a great landlord. However, rumours always circulated about strange happenings connected with that barn, things like eerie smells and sounds. When I was 15 years old, I decided with a few of my cousins and my sister to go near that place. One afternoon, we approached carefully. The place was silent. We could only hear the sound of a soft breeze caressing the wheat in the field nearby. Everyone was nervous. I tried to look inside through a rift in the big wooden gate. That's when I heard an unexpected sound, something that sounded like someone sneaking close to us, stepping slowly, snapping small tree branches as they walked. We all looked at each other to make sure that no one was moving. No one was. We were all sure that the sound was coming from inside the barn. The gate was the only entry, and that was sealed with solid metal chains. Panicked, we all ran away. What happened later that night was much more perplexing. By 9 p.m, my sister and my cousin were washing the dishes in my grandmother's kitchen, and all the others, including me, were in the living room chatting. Suddenly, we heard a plate shatter to pieces. My sister and my cousin ran through the hallway to find us. They looked scared, and so we asked them what was wrong. They told us that the kitchen's second door, a door that led to a small courtyard, was shaking, the door handle moving as though someone was trying to open it. They got scared and dropped the plate to run. When we checked, we found that the door was not locked. On the other side of the small yard onto which it opened were 2 small rooms. No one was in those rooms that night, and the closest house to us was about 2 miles away. It was simply impossible for someone to be playing a prank in the pitch black of that summer night. I made a point of checking the courtyard and the 2 rooms, but found nothing noticeable. Furthermore, there was no wind outside, only a cool summer breeze. Admittedly, I doubted their story, so I decided to stay with them along with my other cousin. We were simply talking in the kitchen for 15 minutes when the door started shaking, violently. Immediately I looked around me to find that everyone had run away. Watching it shake so violently, I thought that the door would be thrown entirely against me. It was simply not something a human could do. The entire door was shaking on its own, and the door handle was moving up and down without the door being opened. The level of panic inside of me was, to put it simply, very high. I could not move, but I had the strength to open my mouth and recite a few verses of the Quran. After a few seconds, everything stopped. Note that all of this happened in a matter of about 1 minute, but it seemed like an hour to me. No one in the living room where our relatives stayed that night heard anything, and none of them believed us. They said that it was the wind that shook the door, but we knew that no wind would ever shake the door that way. Furthermore, we didn't hear the sound of any strong wind while the door was shaking on that windless summer night. My sister, cousins, and I sat together in another room and talked deeply about this, trying to make sense of what we had experienced. I don't know if it stopped shaking because I recited the verses, or if it was simply a short phenomenon. I don't know if what happened that night was connected to our trip to the barn, but it seemed like too much of a coincidence to dismiss it. All I do know is that from that day on, we never went near that barn again. What I am about to describe are a series of events from throughout my still young life. I will try to recall as much detail as possible. I do not remember when exactly this happened, but my age was still in the single digits. As I remember it, I was at my family's church. The church is some 70 years old and built on Indian land, as my father's side is Native American. The church consists of 3 separate buildings: the church itself, the dining hall, and the bathrooms, which are nothing more than fancy heated and lit outhouses. I had gone outside to play, as I often did as a kid. I remember that I got the feeling that someone was in the dining hall that scared me, so I set off to make some distance from the building. I had made it about halfway across the churchyard before I looked over my shoulder and saw it. The black silhouette of a very large man in a wide-brimmed hat and a trench coat. It didn't scare me, it just made me feel uneasy, so I turned and went back into the dining hall where my grandmother and a few other family members were busy cooking. I stood there, staring at my grandmother, waiting for her to acknowledge my existence. She never did, not even when I turned to see the silhouetted figure had come in the back door, and I went to run away from it, back out the front. No sooner than having turned to run, the figure grabbed my arm, with enough force to hold my arm completely still, and yet as though there was no force at all. To this day, I don't know how to explain it, but it seemed like he had placed something inside me, just by holding my arm. I asked, "What is it?" And the figure responded with a mouth that was not there, "It will always be with you." Now, it's important to know that my father's side, even though they are Baptist, still pass down and even believe in some of the old legends. From skinwalkers to even what I've come to recognize as a banshee, my entire life has been in close proximity to the unexplained, so much so that none of this ever bothered me. In fact, I always found it fascinating. The first time I saw a deer running the fence line, only to disappear behind a tree, didn't even bother me. My grandmother said it was because I see things for what they are, not what they are trying to be. A few years later, I asked her what she meant by that, but she changed the subject and refused to answer. My parents divorced when I was 10 or 11, and my father won custody of my sisters and myself. On one of my mother's weekends when I was 13 or 14 years old, we were staying at an aunt's because my mother had been bouncing couches at the time. We were all downstairs, my mother and sisters on one bed, and myself solo on the other. We were watching a karaoke show when I began to feel uneasy. The next thing I remember, my mother was holding me, rocking back and forth, and my sisters were both on the opposite side of the other bed. My little sister was crying hysterically, and my older sister just stared in visible fright. My aunt had been standing in the doorway, almost as if she was waiting on someone to tell her what to do. Myself, I was completely stiff arms, legs and neck locked, chest so tight that it hurt to breathe. Once I could finally sit up on my own, I asked what had happened. That's when my mum asked who had been messing with me. Confused, I asked what she meant, and she said that I had started screaming, "Get away from me," and "Leave me alone," before I started hyperventilating, as if I was having an asthma attack. I couldn't answer. I didn't remember anything that had just happened. I don't remember what we told my father, but I don't think he ever found out what actually happened. After that, everything went smooth for a while, the only thing that could be considered strange being weird moments when animals would show up, when something would happen, or when I needed to do something. The best example I can remember was when I skipped school in the 8th grade. My father worked maintenance for the apartment complex we lived in, so I hid in a wooded area between our complex and another to avoid him coming home and catching me. After getting bored, I gave in to the idea of a shaded nap on a warm spring day. I woke to the sound of dogs aggressively barking at me. I shot up to my feet, looking towards the dogs, 2 pit bulls, 1 brown and 1 white. As soon as I stood up, they quit barking and just stared. Then one of them grunted, and the pair just trotted off through the thicket. Once the dogs were out of sight, I looked at my watch for the time, 1:30. It was around that time that I got home every day. I ran home and never saw them again. At this point in my story, I feel I need to warn you that what comes next may not be easy to hear. I enlisted at 17 and spent the summer between my junior and senior years at basic training. When I got home, I moved in with one of my aunts to help her with the house. For the first time in my life, things seemed like they were going to be okay. I had got my first job, bought a truck, had a beautiful girlfriend, and was in the hot track to an early graduation. Then, that October, things began to go downhill, fast and hard. I got home from work one night and was met by my aunt. She informed me that my great-uncle, the only man I ever looked up to, had been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer and had only been given months to live. Around a week later, I found out, over Facebook, that my girlfriend had decided to dump me for another guy. Then, the wiring in my truck gave out and caused me to lose my job. Depression hit me hard, and with that came a decline in my grades. Life became a day-by-day struggle. Just trying to stay afloat was difficult. It wasn't until my uncle passed and my aunt started blaming me for problems with the house that I finally lost it. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, I took a walk down to the river, found a secluded spot, and was about to end it all, to the point that I had the barrel in my mouth, safety off, and just under enough pressure on the trigger to send the round flying. It was at that exact moment that I heard something running up on me from behind. In one fluid motion, I yanked the barrel from my mouth, swung my head out of the way, and fired over my left shoulder, then jumped to my feet and did a 180, ready to fire again. No sooner had I turned, a deer jumped out of the brush as if being chased by a predator and ran right past me before disappearing into another area of thick vegetation. I never saw where it went. At that point, I had lost the will to end it and so made my way back home. The next day after school, I walked back down to the exact same spot, and there were no signs of anything other than myself being there the night before. No prints, no craters in the sand, no disturbed vegetation, nothing. I am 21 now, and even though I still suffer from anxiety and depression, I am happily married with a boy who just turned a year old. Things, however, still happen. About 6 months ago, I was in a single car accident. I was by myself in the car, thankfully, and all the witnesses said that the way it happened, they did not expect me to be able to get out of the car, let alone walk away unharmed. One man even said that he didn't know how the car didn't flip over. You could pick any side of the car and it would have been deemed totaled. Every side except the driver's side, which remained untouched. I don't know what it is. Call it my guardian angel, saving me from my own destructive life. Call it a demon that's keeping me around just well enough off to continue feeding off my misfortune. Call it what you want, but something has been with me since I was young, and if the shadow is to be believed, it will always be with me. Thank you for watching, and thank you to those who so kindly and courageously decided to share their stories with us. And thank you also to our members both here on YouTube and on Patreon for all the support you show our work. If you enjoyed this, please do subscribe. Ensure you have turned on all notifications by clicking the bell icon to never miss more paranormal content. You can also sign up to my email newsletter over on my website. And if you cannot wait until my next video, why not watch the one suggested on screen now? Until next time.